Of the Z Jaipur Literature Festival in association with Nexa at Charbagh. We're delighted to introduce session number 24, The Hidden History of Burma, presented by the Tribune. We request you to kindly turn your phones on silent mode. We're delighted to have with us Thant Myint-U in conversation with Suhasini Haidar. Thant Myint-U, educated at Harvard and Cambridge, is the author of 4 books on Burmese and Asian history. Most recently, The Hidden History of Burma, Race, Capitalism, and the Crisis of Democracy in the 21st Century. Suhasini Haidar, a diplomatic and national editor at The Hindu. Please join me in welcoming them.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us on this session. I've been looking forward to the session because not only am I a big fan of the author's current book, but also of his previous book, When China Meets India. The truth is that when we look at Burma or Myanmar, and we will get to that question, of which you should call it, all reporting seems to fall into 2 convenient binaries. You either speak about the lady, Aung San Suu Kyi, Daw Suu Kyi, now called Aung Suu Kyi, or you speak about the military junta and what it has done since the 1940s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the elections in the 70s, and everything that has followed that. The truth is that in a sense, when it came to the imprisonment of Aung San Suu Kyi, the world was racked with shame. Because it didn't matter what the world did, the factor of her imprisonment, her incarceration, just seemed to go on and on for decades. So as a result, when Burma's ruling military actually decided not only to free her, but to hold elections, it became a kind of world victory, if you like. And it filled us with hope so much. Now, as a UN official, an advisor to the Myanmar president, an author, an analyst, Thant Myint-U has always been the insider with an outsider's view. And we'll talk about why that is so important in looking at what has happened there. Because his latest work, The Hidden History of Burma, is actually the story of what happened, which is not just about those 2 binaries. Because clearly there was something else that happened that ensured that between 2015, when Burma was the toast of the world, and Daw Suu Kyi was really the hope of the world, to today, and all that has happened in these last 5 years, that somehow that dream has died. Was it the fault of the dream? Did the dream disappoint everyone? Or was that dream, in a sense, based on false hope? So I'll come to you with that question. When Obama spoke about the audacity of hope, was it truly audacious to even think that the junta would crumble and hand over to democracy so easily?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. I think if we start with that, I've been trying not just with this last book, The Hidden History of Burma, but for the 2 books before, to try to give people a sense of this broader context in which everything is happening. Because as you said, for 25 years plus, the whole story of Burma has been about Daw Aung San Suu Kyi and the generals. And I wrote The River of Lost Footsteps to give people a sense of Burma's history more generally, to give people a sense that this is a country of 56, 57 million people with 70 years of ethnic and armed conflict, which has deep colonial legacies as well, which have been very difficult to manage with China next door. And then in China Meets India, to talk about the neighborhood, the coming influence of China, the way in which India has tried to react. And then in this most recent book, I think really to try to give or demythologize Burma. And when up until 2011, most people assumed from the outside that Burma was the darkest of military dictatorships and nothing was ever going to change. And then the moment things began to change in 2011, the pendulum swung completely in the other direction, and people assumed that Burma was going to be a prosperous, peaceful democracy within a few years. And I think this background of Burma, the colonial background, the recent background, the effects of military dictatorship, are completely not unknown, but they're often pushed aside. And people have been so eager to embrace this easy narrative, and I think that's been a big part of the problem.
You know, as I said, what really sets you apart from so many authors who write about their own countries is you've always had that sort of eye from outside. You grew up actually in the United States to begin with, going back to Burma maybe when you were 8 years old. So take us through some of it in terms of what led to that decision from the generals, particularly General Thant Myint-U, to actually try and script some kind of an exit from power and to allow some sort of democracy to come in.
I mean, when things began to change in 2011, everyone wanted to claim credit. So those who had pushed sanctions claimed it was because of the pressure of sanctions. Those countries and governments which had engaged the generals had said it was because of their engagement, and ASEAN countries did in particular. But in reality, this was very much about internal politics. So if we go back 12 years, you take General Thant Myint-U, who was the head of the junta, and we say junta, but actually it was really an autocracy of one man by that point. And General Thant Myint-U had pushed aside most of his competitors. He was about to be 80 years old. And if you're a dictator and a general and you're about to be 80 and you want to retire, you only have a few choices. You can either hand over power to another general, but that would then risk the possibility that that general would turn on him and his family in the way that he had turned on his predecessor's family to some extent.
And we've certainly seen that in our neighborhood,
In
not
many,
just in
yeah.
Burma.
Or he could choose not to retire and be on his deathbed in a weakened state, and that wouldn't be necessarily good, at least for his family. And he chose a very creative third route, which was to engineer what was to come. And so he decided to fracture the political landscape to establish this new constitutional order, which would be a fractured, semi-democratic order, to retire all of the generals around him, to recycle some into this new setup. And all of that was, to a large extent, to ensure that he had this soft landing, this exit, this retirement. And that then set the stage for everything that was to come in 2011 and 2012.
All right. Of course, in 2007 was Nargis?
Nargis was in 2000.
In 2007, and there is a chapter which is very evocatively written in the book about what Cyclone Nargis did in Myanmar. 138,000 people died. There is a story of this one man who in his home just kept going out there, finding more people, bringing them back, somehow trying to survive on this rice cooked with salted water. How much of an impact did Cyclone Nargis and the helplessness of the junta, in a sense, to take care of people have on these political changes?
Yeah,
then?
enormous influence. And I think, we can talk more about climate change, but I mean, Nargis, in a way, is an example of what might be around the corner. These extreme weather events, like Nargis, which killed almost 140,000 people over about 6 to 9 hours, and made millions of other people homeless in Burma, led to, I think, 3 different things. I mean, one is just the humanitarian impact of that tragedy, which is still being felt. The second is, to some extent, the hypocrisy of those who impose sanctions from the outside, ostensibly to help people in Burma. But because of those sanctions, almost all Western countries were unable to give aid to help rebuild homes, for example. So even though there was this enormous demand, even pressure to go to the UN Security Council to demand that aid be allowed in, when aid was actually allowed in, most governments then just turned away, never gave the kind of aid that had been promised. But I think within the country, there was a big psychological impact. I think people saw much more clearly that even though we were under a military dictatorship, the capacity of the state was actually much lower than people thought. And I think for many of the generals themselves as well, this had a big impact. So General Thein Sein, who later became President Thein Sein, he had actually lost many of his relatives in that cyclone. And I think for him, and maybe for others as well, this idea that something had to change, that we couldn't simply carry on in this way, I think became a much more powerful sort of force over those next few years.
Very, very interesting. For so many years we saw Burma as this closed country. I don't think people thoroughly appreciate how quickly it opened up. You know, as a journalist there, even in 2012, I remember being taken to this, this restaurant across the road. It was like a shack, it was like a dhaba, across the road from Aung San Suu Kyi's party headquarters, the headquarters of the NLD. You know, there was folklore that if you wanted, and I was a TV journalist in those days, that if you wanted to actually take a picture of the NLD, you would be arrested if you tried to take it openly. So in this shack was a place where we were told you could look across the road and film the NLD. So in my mind's eye, because you know journalists have all these dreams which never actually get you know, actually get actualized, I had this picture of taking a picture of this window through which you could look at the NLD headquarters. The truth was it wasn't as dramatic as that, but the owner did take me to this place where these coats were put up on a hook, and he took one of the coats off, and there was this tiny little hole through which people would come and look at the NLD headquarters. This changed dramatically just before the election, the by-election, which Aung San Suu Kyi was elected in. And suddenly you had these crowds coming outside. But that wasn't the only change. I mean, as you describe in your book, you know, suddenly the restrictions on newspapers were lifted. Suddenly jails were opened up. Suddenly a lot happened. Tell us something about that.
Yeah, and I think people were completely confused in terms of why that happened. And because they had to try to connect the story that they knew of this democratic opposition led by Aung San Suu Kyi against the generals with what was happening, people assumed it was a result of either sanctions or pressure or a grassroots democratic movement, whereas the truth was something completely different. And I think when I first thought about writing this book, I thought it was going to be mainly a political history of why things really changed in 2011. And for those of you who may not remember and may not know, in 2011 we moved to this new constitutional order. And if it was just that, I think many people would still have dismissed this as cosmetic change to a military dictatorship at best. But within 6 months, hundreds and then later thousands of political prisoners were freed, the media was freed, censorship was ended, internet censorship was ended completely. All of these things happened together with economic reforms and everything else, and Aung San Suu Kyi herself was released and then entered parliament as well. And I interviewed at length many of the ex-generals who were involved. And, you know, I think in the United States in particular, there's this, not a myth, but there's this assumption that a lot of this was about China, that Burma and the Burmese generals had fallen into this Chinese embrace. They were keen to move away from China, and this was part of a pivot towards the West. But actually, when you speak to the generals, you realize that what happened was slightly random and accidental. It was a few specific ex-generals who went completely off script and pushed these liberalizations much further than was intended, and they did this for completely different reasons individually as well.
There's a funny bit in the book where you talk about these ministers coming to see you, and some of them are ex-generals, and they essentially say, we don't know what's going to happen in 6 months. We might even be in jail in 6 months. Was that the sense of uncertainty over the reforms?
I think in that time, in those first, because no one really knew what they could get away with. I mean, again, you know, this was from a dictatorship that really brooked no dissent. Within months, things were changing very fast. So I think even the ministers who were ex-generals didn't know what they could get away with as well. And then those of us who were helping, advising, trying to encourage from the side, we were doing all kinds of things. I remember one of my colleagues at the time gave one of the ministers, one of the senior reformist ministers who was an ex-general, a box set of West Wing, because they had no idea how a democratic government or a democratic presidential office was meant to work.
Was
and they
it
didn't
VHS?
know.
Was it?
So I mean, I can't remember exactly. But I mean, we take it for granted that we know what a democracy is meant to be up to a point. But these guys were isolated and had no idea. So I mean, there was a steep learning curve, and actually many mistakes made along the way as well.
All right. On that note, let's turn to the other part, the lady herself. Nobody could have scripted a story like hers. You know, loses her father, goes abroad, comes back to join this students' protest, wins the election, is put in jail straight after. The world clamors for her release over the years. I'm really scrunching things and speeding them along. But here she is, and eventually she's freed. She's allowed to stand for elections. In the next elections, her party, sweeps everything. In the UK Parliament, Aung San Suu Kyi was referred to as the conscience of a country, a heroine for humanity, Nobel Prize, the Amnesty Award, all the rest of that. Give us a sense of just how the cult of Aung San Suu Kyi, in fact, grew the way it did. Because until a couple of years ago, I think she was seen along with, Nelson Mandela and others.
I think there are two different stories or myths or stories about Aung San Suu Kyi. I think the first is the one you described, which grew up outside. So she won the Nobel Prize in the early 1990s, and I think at that time in the 1990s, when when democracy promotion around the world and even violent intervention on the side of democracy was not questioned by many people, but when Asia was also rising and becoming more prosperous, I think this idea of someone in this distant country in Asia who seemed to be fighting for liberal, Western, democratic values was incredibly attractive. And the fact that she was under house arrest and could say very little during those years meant that one could paint into that picture almost anything that one wanted. So I think for a lot of people in the West, this became an incredibly appealing story, which had no sort of boundaries. You could sort of read into it whatever you wanted. I think in Burma itself, it was very different. And I think there she was seen as the inheritor of her father, General Aung San's legacy as a nationalist figure. And I think Aung San Suu Kyi as a nationalist figure who would overthrow or end dictatorship and restore the nation to its rightful place, I think that was the much more powerful story within the country.
All right. Of course, Myanmar sees itself as a part of the ASEAN. But in one part, it is very like South Asia. Indira Gandhi, Benazir Bhutto, Chandrika Kumaratunga, Sheikh Hasina. Did Suu Kyi, in that sense, really fit in with that mold of these women who've come through tragedy, whose father, in a sense, holds a very, very respected position? And is that something that was much more a South Asian thing?
I don't know if it's a more South Asian thing, but it's certainly, I think it's at the core of who she believes she is. I think her father, who was the very young nationalist leader, he died. He was assassinated in 1947 at age 33. She was 2 or 3 years old at the time. She never really knew him properly. But I think she's always been in his shadow and has always wanted to fulfill his legacy in a certain way. So I think this is, this idea that this is her father's army, which has gone in the wrong direction, and she is the one who's going to right it, I think is what drives her more than anything else.
That's interesting. And when you think of the sacrifices, because it wasn't just about the fact that she spent so much of her life in custody. It is that she literally couldn't go to see her husband in his dying days, that she practically had to give up her children.
I mean, she went through this incredibly. I mean, I think for most Burmese people, this is also the source of this enormous support for her to this day, which is this idea that she sacrificed this other life for love of her country. And I think despite a lot of criticism from many different quarters over the past couple of years, I think for the average Burmese person, this story of sacrifice for the country is still a very strong one.
All right. I want to return to Aung San Suu Kyi in just a bit, but I want to go back to that idea we were discussing about identity. To begin with, let's answer that question. Is it Burma or is it Myanmar? Because I do remember in the middle almost being given the impression that if you said Myanmar, in a sense, as a journalist, you were accepting the junta. And if you said Burma, it meant you were keeping a little bit of that freedom spark alive. What is your take really on the Burma versus Myanmar question?
Well, I mean, I personally just like the word Burma better, which is the reason I use it in the book. And I think it's been a silly kind of debate in many ways. In the 1990s, when it was politically incorrect to say Myanmar, I sometimes said Myanmar. But now that everyone says Myanmar, I like to use Burma. So I think it's just a nicer word to use, and I think people can be much more relaxed about it than before. I don't think people have such. But officially, it's Myanmar in the country, and in Burmese, it's Myanmar as well. So it's a change of the English word for the country more than anything else.
All right. Written into the fact that the Burmese or the Myanmar culture, is the fact that, as you pointed out right at the beginning, that people completely turn aside, which is that Burma has just so many ethnicities.
Yeah.
It has so many still armed insurgencies. And then you have the entire Rohingya question. So explain that a little bit to us, because then it brings us up to speed with what else happened.
Yeah.
Then with
I mean, I suppose one way to think, I mean, we all obviously know partition in 1947, but I think people often forget that the first partition of British India happened 10 years before, in 1937, when Burma was created as a separate part of the British Empire. And I think that was partly the result of different British policy calculations, but it was also because of a push by a new generation of Burmese politicians that were coming to the fore after the First World War, which saw Burma as a distinct civilization, culture, and a distinct race of people. And so if Pakistan was partitioned in 47 on the basis of a difference in religion, I mean, Burma was partitioned in 1937 because both the British and the Burmese saw themselves as racially distinct. And once you did that, you then had to define what then is the Burmese nation. And the British had ruled the Burmese lowlands separately from the uplands. And so the lowlands were kind of easy because it was, you know, the vast majority were ethnic Burmese. But in the uplands, you had many other peoples, many of whom had become Christian because of missionary influence in the early 20th century. And so after independence, these people needed to be sort of welded into a new country. And I think the core problem in Burmese politics since independence has been this inability to imagine this new nation and bring everyone on board, and to set the boundaries of who really belongs and who doesn't. And this question of who belongs, who doesn't, has been at the root of so many problems, including most recently the Rohingya violence and crisis as well. I mean, just one last thing to say is that, you know, for I think what many people may not realize from the outside, but is really important to think about, is that this is a country which has not known a single year of peace since World War II. And we have over 24 different, what we call ethnic armed organizations or insurgencies, as well as maybe 1,000 different militia in these uplands. And there has been bloody conflict really since independence.
Now, one of the reasons for the entire, you know, what is called as the Rohingya exodus by some, and the fact that so many, up to 1 million, had to actually flee Burma. Many have said that the first event was really a terror attack by an Arakan group. But the fact is that over the years, Rohingyas did see their rights being degraded. I remember covering one particular election when up to the last minute you didn't actually know if Rohingyas would be able to vote. And certainly, including from the NLD, including from Aung San Suu Kyi's party, an entire roster of candidates who had been in the parliament before were disqualified because the rules changed about how Rohingyas were seen.
I mean, to what point you go back in history kind of determines where you stand on politics today. And in that borderland between what is today Bangladesh and Burma, you have extremely poor people. And you have extremely poor people who in British days were also very poor. But the British census takers came and basically forced everyone to decide what they really were, try to classify them in different ways. And then people have also started to internalize these identities over the past 60 or 70 years. But I think even more important than the identity conflicts there has been the steady impoverishment of this whole region over 60, 70 years of isolation and military rule. And then when all of a sudden the political environment opened up in 2011, this area was ripe for political manipulation from the outside. So to some extent, the violence there has the aspect of a communal violence between these two communities who are deeply distrustful of one another, the Buddhist, Arakanese speaking, and then the Muslim, Rohingya speaking, who speak basically a dialect of Bengali. But to some extent, this is also the result of a certain type of politics that was born in 2011 as well. And the deeper issue is this issue not just of discrimination, but for all the communities in that region of impoverishment, isolation, no funding of the education system, a deep sense of grievance and betrayal by all sides, and a government which has done nothing over the past many decades to try to instill any kind of cross-community integration or anything other than ill feeling. But you're right. I mean, the current crisis was ignited by the appearance of a new insurgency on the side of the Rohingya in 2016, which attacked government forces. Aung San Suu Kyi, I think to her credit, in 2016, had actually appointed Kofi Annan to head a new commission. And I think she wouldn't have done that unless she felt she really wanted to try to tackle the root causes of this issue. But the insurgency gave her almost no space in which to do very much over that year, and then other events got in the way as well.
Well, certainly this is now seen as the prism through which Burma is looked at. The way the Rohingya crisis played out, the horrific stories, the brutal stories of the kind of violence that those who fled to Bangladesh have spoken of, whether it's murder of children, rapes, and all the rest of that. Do you think the international reaction to what happened essentially was the reason why the junta then decided, or I shouldn't keep calling them junta anymore, I'm talking about the military establishment really, that the military establishment and in a way the political establishment too, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, decided once again to turn away from the world?
I think it's a couple of things that we have to remember. The first is that the exodus of 700,000 people in 2017, which caught headlines all around the world, took place in the context of very brutal violence on the ground. But this is in the broader context of a brutal civil war that has been fought for 70 years. So it didn't happen out of the blue, but it happened on the side of ongoing conflicts that have displaced hundreds of thousands of other people, even over the past several years. So for instance, even in Arakan or Rakhine State today, another 100,000 people, this time Buddhist Arakanese, have been displaced in fighting. So I think we have to understand that broader conflict. I think the Western and international reaction did catch the government off guard. I think it's wrong to think that the military is still in charge. I think on this issue between the military and the political leadership under Aung San Suu Kyi, there probably isn't that much difference in terms of position and strategy. I think that the Burmese desire to stay independent of any overwhelming outside influence is still very strong. But because of this dramatic cooling of relations, especially with the West, not so much of countries in the region like India, it's not so much a dependence on China, but it's opened up a new opportunity for China to try to push the much stronger relationship that it wants.
All right, we will come back to China. But I do want to ask, the religious nationalism that you are now referring to is by no means only Burma's problem right now. If you look in South Asia, practically every government is a democracy, but is grappling with some kind of religious nationalism, or is in fact a part of a religious nationalistic movement. And even newer elections, like in Sri Lanka, are showing that the dominant religion of each country, whether it is India, whether it is Sri Lanka, whether it is Bangladesh or Pakistan, or whether it is Myanmar, the dominant religion of that country is looking for political power. Do you think, in a sense, this is just the outcome of democracy and Burma just took to it very quickly?
I think it's a few different things. I mean, one is that you remember the monks' protests that a lot of people were supportive of 12 years ago. And I think under military dictatorship, the monks played a crucial role in terms of ensuring support for vulnerable people in villages. They were very close to local communities. And this kind of Buddhist nationalism grew up, which was actually anti-military, and was anti the kind of development that people had felt was very unfair to poor and working class people in the country. After 2013, we had a telecoms revolution, and the country went from maybe 2% of people with phone access to 98% on smartphones and on Facebook.
I'm just going to stop you there to recount, there was a period in which I went into Yangon, Rangoon, and was horrified because the telephones that you got were those WLL, fixed line, those big phones. You had to put down a $500.
Yeah, it was up to $1,000 for a SIM card at that time.
Yeah, and a SIM card. And I must have gone back 2 years later, and suddenly, a SIM card costs the equivalent of 25 rupees, less than $1. So the difference was extreme.
Yeah.
But carry
And
on.
we have some of the fastest internet speeds now in the region. So everyone is suddenly on Facebook, and you see in both very good things, but also a lot of hate speech on social media as well. But I would caution against, I'm not really sure that this narrative of religious nationalism really is the right one. Because I think you do see Buddhist nationalist movements, but we have to remember that in 2015, the party of the generals and ex-generals had attempted to play this religious nationalist card, and people voted overwhelmingly for the National League for Democracy.
It actually got an endorsement from the most famous.
That's right. But people voted overwhelmingly for Aung San Suu Kyi, the NLD, who didn't use that. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is that, I think what is so much more important in Burma than identity and religious nationalism in a way is the huge economic inequality that has developed in the country. And in a way, the identity politics, and there is a lot of identity politics, and in a way, there is unparalleled mobilization based on identity. Every group, subgroup is setting up their own NGOs, CSOs, armed group, militia, political parties. But in a way, what that masks is an underlying, unfair, unequal political economy. And if you go to Rangoon and you go to an expensive hotel, you'll see businessmen doing deals and going to each other's parties and weddings across every religious, racial, and ethnic line. Whereas it's the communities on the ground, like in Arakan, where it's extremely poor people who have been set against one another, often by outside political influences, not as something that has come from their communities themselves.
When you wrote When China Meets India, it looked very much like Myanmar was India's influence area to lose. Do you feel the same way today? Because today we see pictures of Chinese President Xi in Myanmar. We don't see the kind of protests we saw over the Sitwe port or over the Maitsun Dam against Chinese development in Myanmar. Is that something where China now has the upper hand?
We're at an inflection point because on the one hand, I think there's a Burmese nationalism that's extremely and has always been suspicious of China. And I think even within or perhaps even especially within the military establishment, because of what's perceived to be long-standing links between China and many of the ethnic armed groups in the country, there's a deep suspicion. But because of the Rohingya issue and the cooling of relations with the West, I think Burmese nationalists are not sure in which direction to turn and who should be seen as the greater problem or the greater threat. So there's that. I think President Xi Jinping came last week. He was the first Chinese leader to come in 19 years. The Burmese signed a whole series of agreements. The Chinese are pushing very hard with their Belt Road Initiative and what they call the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, which would be a $30, $40, $50 billion set of infrastructure schemes that would really integrate Burma very closely to Chinese markets. And if that happens, I think China's economic influence over the country, whatever the political influence, will be overwhelming. And it would mean for India that China, which in some ways seems still very far away, will be right up against India's border in a way that it's never been before in history.
Well, certainly whether you look at any of our neighbors, you see Nepal, similar sorts of questions are being asked. I think you used the term a gourd, a soft gourd caught between two cacti. The Bhutanese use the term of a sandwich, I think. The Nepali government, which earlier would have always spoken about India first, is now doing a little bit of a balancing act as well. Do you think essentially this is a factor of China just pushing in for some sort of a link all the way through to the Bay of Bengal?
I mean, part of it is what the Chinese government is doing in terms of proposing these projects. But actually, if you look at it, very few of the actual projects have been agreed to, much less actually implemented. I think what it is much more than sort of government-to-government projects and relations is just this huge weight of Chinese economic gravity. I mean, if you look at Yunnan, which is one of China's poorest provinces, but is a province next to Burma, it has gone from a per capita GDP more or less the same as Burma 10, 12 years ago to 4 to 5 times richer today. So it's just having this much greater, economically much more dynamic neighbor, which means that hundreds of thousands of Chinese people have immigrated to Burma to set up businesses. Thousands of other private business deals have been done. We're expecting 1 million Chinese tourists over the coming year. So it's that as much as government-to-government relations. And the main competitor with China in Burma actually is probably Japan, which has also tried to provide assistance and push their companies and investment as well. Whereas India, there hasn't really been that kind of projection or attempt to project Indian economic power in Burma, whether it's an issue of capacity or policy. And instead, I think, even though the relations with India have been so close in the past, and we have this shared history, the familiarity just isn't there. And the connections with China are much closer now in many different ways.
I have to ask, how much of this does have to do with the fact that the India-Myanmar border actually has Rakhine? And India's own allergy, if you like, now to taking any immigrants in. Bangladesh is similar, grappling with the problem. Eventually, they might think about moving 1 million people to an island that's practically floating right now. How much of this is about, the grappling with migration, with illegal immigration? And I do want to ask you, long before India thought of a Citizenship Amendment Act, which is based on religion, Myanmar has looked at acts and laws that have changed the idea of citizenship. Any lessons learned or advice that you'd like to pass on?
In some ways, I suppose you can see Burma as a warning to everyone. Because since the 1920s, this idea of an ethnic-based nationalism, of a nationalism based on race, this concept of an indigenous people against people who are migrants, has been, again, as I mentioned before, part of the Burmese political DNA from the start. And that led, understandably to some extent, to policies which privileged people who were seen as indigenous, who tried to change, policies that tried to change the economy in the 1950s and 1960s, that led to the exodus of 400,000 ethnic Indians back to India in the 1960s. But that also led to 40 years of impoverishment and intellectual impoverishment in the country, isolation, nativism, everything else that really has destroyed so much of the country over these past many years as well. So I don't know exactly what the lessons of Burma are in that way, but it's a country which has seen this idea of I think the Burmese see themselves as a small country that can at any point be overwhelmed. But I think in thinking about relations today, I would just make one point, which is that, if you go back to my grandfather or great-grandfather's time, people would travel all the time to Calcutta. And Calcutta was the great city of the region. And Rangoon was to some extent a satellite of Calcutta. And that geography has been completely changed by two partitions. The separation of Burma from British India, and then the partition of India in 1947, which means we have all kinds of different borders between Northeast India and Bangladesh, between Bangladesh and West Bengal, between Bangladesh and Burma, which wasn't there before. And I think it's coming to terms with those borders, and with an even deeper history of the relationship between Bengal and its periphery, Assam, Arakan, Manipur, Burma, which is still unresolved in so many ways.
Which very few people actually think about. They just see the India-Myanmar frontier, but not all that has happened in the last 70 years. There's a lovely line in your book, which is actually quite tragic, which said, "The story had changed, but the world saw only a fairy tale." This story, this is the entire thesis of the book, is how this story changed while the world fixated on a fairy tale playing out in Burma, that Burma was going to now follow a course that everyone assumed would go in a certain direction. This is a bold book, Thant Myint. Do you worry about going back after having written it?
Going back from here, yeah, I think it's okay, or I hope it's okay. But I think it is, people don't really talk about these issues so much in Burma. And I think one of the reasons I wanted to write the book is, especially after interviewing so many people and traveling around the country these past few years, the conclusion I sort of reached is that, even more important than these politics of democratic change, even more important than these issues of identity, is the fact that poor Burmese people are as poor as ever, and they are the losers constantly over the past 25 years, whatever the policies, sanctions, everything else. And, it's their fate and their plight that I think needs to be highlighted, and which I've tried to do in my book as well. And if you go back to the 1990s, I think the great, if not tragedy, then I think the thing that we have to think about is that you had a country that was already isolated, war-torn, decades of conflict, decades of dictatorship. A new kind of capitalism had been reborn in the early 1990s after failed socialist experiments, rising inequality, illicit economies. Was democracy really the magic formula that should have been put forward as the only answer to all of Burma's problems? And yet the whole world did that. Not the whole world, but the West and to some extent the UN and others did that. And I think we're living with the consequences of seeing democracy, however good it is, and I'm not anti-democracy, but I think democracy is an important thing, but not seeing in any way what a realistic sort of sequencing of things could be that could lead to a sustainable democracy. And it's this separation also of economic issues from politics that I think has been so difficult so problematic in Burma as well. This economic plight of ordinary people, this rising economic inequality that really needs to be put front and center, I think, of people's thinking about both the present and the future.
And it does come through very strongly in your book. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for the author, because you've been extremely honest about an issue for which is the most difficult to be honest about, which is your own country. I do have time for questions, so do you want to just put up your hands and I'll try and get a mic to you. I always start with the front, so today I'm going to start with the back. Could we just take the mic right to the back? There's a gentleman who's already standing up, so I guess you can give him the mic.
Hi, my name is Yagya, and I read one of the lesser known books of George Orwell called Burmese Days. So it's his account of his life in British colonial Burmese days. And one of the main themes of that was corruption. So I want to know, how is that changed over the years in the modern Burmese, and how does it play, how does it play in immigration and the protests and everything going on?
All right, should we take a few questions?
Sure.
Or if that's okay? I'll remember. Where's the mic? Okay, go ahead. Why don't you go to the lady who's got her hand up? Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask, in the context of the Citizenship Amendment Act in India recently, to what extent do you think that is a response to refugee crises in the region, particularly the Rohingya genocide? Do you think it's a direct response to that event?
Okay, and there's a gentleman just behind you with his hand up. Yeah, I think they've got a mic.
Hi, I just came back from a session which said that language has so much of influence on your culture. Hello, am I heard?
Yeah.
Language has so much of influence on your culture, and religion definitely does so. The world looks upon the Buddhist people because the Buddhist culture is all about peace, Zen-like, tranquility, etc. And then I hear from you that your country has always been under conflict. In fact, you might not be knowing, but the only way in which Buddha learned and eventually got his salvation has been brought from Myanmar to here, which we follow here is Vipassana. If you are aware of that. So, are the people in Myanmar truly Buddhist or just labeled as Buddhist? Because why is there so much of conflict?
All right. Do you want
It's an oxymoron of sorts.
Okay, a few different things. On the issue of citizenship and the Rohingya crisis, I don't know. I mean, that's more for people here to say whether the Rohingya exodus and perceptions of what might happen next has in any way influenced thinking about citizenship and threats to the country here. I think on the question of corruption, it's a really great question. I think George Orwell said that, I don't remember the exact quote, but he said something like, if we're honest, the British are pilfering the Burmese, sort of right, left, and center. And in colonial times, there was corruption, but even more than that, it was an incredibly exploitative political economy where everything was about the extraction of natural resources and the export of primary commodities to the benefit of a few mainly British companies. And of course, Burma was established at the time as a racial hierarchy, but it was also established as a modern country on the basis of this very exploitative political economy. What that led to in the 1950s and 60s was an ultra-left reaction. So for Burmese politics for 40 years was completely dominated by socialist and communist parties and movements. And then those were seen to have failed. And in 1989, there was a rebirth of a certain type of capitalism. And that capitalism, partly because of Western sanctions, has been completely oriented towards China. It has been very much tied to the armed conflicts in the region. It has been very much tied to illicit industries, including the drugs trade in the past. Today, the methamphetamine trade or industry in Burma is estimated by the UN as worth $60 billion a year. So there is corruption like there is in many other countries in the region. It's not worse than many other countries in the region. But more than that, there is this structure of the political economy that is tied to gray markets, black markets, illicit economies, that has been the seed of the Burmese capitalist economy since its inception 30 years ago. I think what the last question was about Buddhism. Yeah. So I think it's interesting because I think you do see in Burma a lot of influence of Buddhism. So in many ways, you go to Rangoon, you go to Mandalay, people are incredibly religious. It's a fairly peaceful society in many ways. And people are very serious about their religion. People spend a lot of time in meditation, in monasteries, in meditation practices. But then what you have is this other British legacy, which is the entire uplands of the country, which was only lightly administered by the British, have never been under any modern state or experienced any kind of equitable or inclusive development. And it's not a coincidence that these are the very regions which have been impossible for the Burmese state since independence to fully control. You had also in the 50s the incursion of Chinese nationalist troops. You had in the late 1960s the PRC, Chinese government from Beijing, basically igniting a new communist revolt in this area as well. So it's been a place that's been impossible to control. So I think what you have to think about in Burma is not sort of an ongoing intense war, though sometimes it is quite intense. But this vast area, maybe a third of the country, an area about the size of England, where you have a patchwork of army battalions, warlords, militia, ethnic armed groups involved in business but also fighting one another. It's this unfinished kind of attempt at creating a nation which has failed basically since independence in 1948.
All right. Questions? Where's the mic? Oh, there you are. Okay, there's a lady behind you. You can just go to her. Okay.
I just want three quick questions. One is the opinion of yours on the fact that when you identified about 135 communities, the only one that was not accepted in the new constitution was the Rohingyas. So, I mean, you get the official version, but what was the reason why it was left out? There are unspoken truths about it, so if your views on that. And if you would like to...
Can we just restrict it to one?
Yeah, I'm just leaving the thing, they're all linked.
Yeah,
the
all right,
FMR
because I
and
wanted to
the
take some...
Kabao Valley, anything that you would like to say on those?
Why don't okay. Go ahead, sir.
Are you listening?
Yeah.
Till 1947, they were in this subcontinent. Both the Bengal and the Burma, they were very prosperous and integrated with India. But in 1947, Bangladesh became a part of the Pakistan, and Burma, after independence, deteriorated constantly because there was the influence of Buddhism and the monks.
You're speaking about economic development? Okay. Yeah.
Deterioration, constantly deterioration. But somehow by 1970, after the formation of Bangladesh, there was a dictatorship for 10 years or so.
Sir, we will need a question.
Yeah, I want that after Aung San Suu Kyi became the Prime Minister,
State Councillor.
she could not bring any visible change.
Okay. Why has she not been able
With so much Western backing and India's backing and all that.
Super.
So
And the gentleman behind
and
you.
it remained behind to Bangladesh.
Got- All right.
So, and another part of
No,
the
sir, let's just restrict it. The gentleman behind you.
Thank you so much, finally. And I'll just piggyback a little bit on that.
Yeah.
Aung San Suu Kyi, can I get a fly on the wall view of some of the pulls and pressures that she goes through, especially in the context of what we saw in 2017 with the Rohingya issue? Because I was very perplexed to see what was happening. We were expecting something else was happening. So I'm sure there are internal pulls and pressures, and they might be in your book also, so I apologize, this is redundant, but I'd be really happy if you could sort of shed some light. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so please read the book. I think that's it.
Yes.
That would be my
It is in the
my
book,
thing.
yeah.
Because in a way, it is what you say. I mean, it is the narrative of what happened, right? I think you have to understand a couple of things. One is that, going back to the question about Nargis, this was a state that was actually very weak. It was a military dictatorship, so you assume that it can kind of press a button and anything happens. But instead, it was actually a state that was fraying in so many different ways. That's one. The second is that the NLD, Aung San Suu Kyi, came to office in 2016 after 25 years of being battered, bruised, locked up, many of its members exiled, in prison, and was nothing like prepared for the pressures and the policy decisions they would have to make in office, which is part of the reason I think she appointed Kofi Annan to give her advice on what to do on the Rohingya and Rakhine situation. It was also at a time when I think the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi coming into office were not sure, I think, of whether or not the military was going to try to trap them, that they had allowed them to win the elections, come into office, but was there some trap in the making, something around the corner they couldn't see? So they were extremely worried that first year of falling into a trap. And then all of a sudden this violence broke out in Rakhine, the ARSA insurgency erupted, and I think they were very unsure what space they even had vis-a-vis the military establishment at that time. But there were many other factors as well, including what was happening on social media. I remember in 2017, the paranoia in this country, in Burma, that ARSA, which had only attacked in this very remote area on the Bangladesh border, was this new Islamicist threat to the entire country. And there were many rumors that there were Islamic jihadi cells in Rangoon, that children were going to be kidnapped, that the water wells were going to be poisoned, all of these things. And this demand for the government to take action against this new group was maybe not overwhelming, but was extremely strong. So it was within that environment, you'll see in the book, that there were many other factors just week by week that led to a specific and very tragic outcome for the country, not just for the Rohingya, but for the country as a whole by 2017. I think with the question about economic change, yeah, I agree. I mean, in one way, Burma was a much more prosperous country relative to other countries. China was at civil war in the early 20th century. But Burma was also a country which faced famine-like conditions in the 1930s in part. It was a very unequal society, and it was a society where ordinary Burmese people were at the bottom of the social and economic pyramid as well. So I think there's a tendency sometimes to romanticize a period in colonial history where Burma was seen as this incredibly prosperous place, and it only needs to return to that. Whereas in real life, and again, you'll see in my book, I think it's the ordinary Burmese worker, poor person, who's really been the loser throughout a century of colonial rule and then all the way up to the present as well. In the last few years, actually, incomes have risen 50 or 60%. I mean, some good economic decisions were made by the last government. This government has continued them to some extent, but it's coupled with rising anxiety, rising inequality. So where that story goes is still remains to be seen. And then in terms of 135 ethnic groups and why Rohingya are not included in that list, I mean, this is almost sacrilegious to say in Burma, but I just think this list of 135 is a little bit silly. It's based on, to some extent, on the 1931, 1921 British India censuses. The generals in the 1980s, 1990s knew that their socialist experiment was failing, began to grab onto nativist ideas, ethno-nationalist ideas as a way of filling a political vacuum, and came up with this list. based on, I think, a reading and a misreading of past British census categories, which were the linguistic categories. And so it's a fairly arbitrary list. But the reason that the Rohingya are not on it goes back to what I was saying before about this failed attempt to determine who belongs and who doesn't belong. So people of Indian and Chinese descent who immigrated to the country were seen as not indigenous, and many left in the 1950s and 1960s. But at the borders, up in Kokang in the northeast, you have people who are ethnic Chinese, but who've been on this side of the border, if not for generations, if not for centuries, then for generations. And then with the Rohingya, you have people who are very similar to Chittagonian-speaking people on the other side, who were also part of a colonial era, or some of whom were part of a colonial era migration into the country. So at the margins, this question of do these people really belong to this new Burma that is being constructed or not has been unresolved. And I think this question of the specific sort of animus towards the Muslim community there, the Rohingya community there, I think is actually relatively new. I think if you went back 10 years, the average person in Rangoon or Mandalay wouldn't have given it, even 5 minutes of thought in a given year. But what happened was that in 2012, 2013, at exactly the same moment that people had phones for the first time, were connected to the first time, they saw three things happening. The first was that they saw communal violence, which had happened before between these communities. Then they saw images of ISIS, Al-Qaeda in Syria and Iraq. And then they also saw, closer to their own communities, other sporadic instances of politically incited communal violence. All of these things merged in people's minds to this idea of the Rohingya and the Rohingya insurgency being a very specific Islamicist threat to the country as a whole and a threat to the new Burmese democracy. And I think that has kind of shaped what is still a kind of inchoate sort of Burmese nationalism over these past 6 or 7 years.
All right, we're completely out of time, so I'm just going to quickly ask you. So it's a revised fairy tale, if you like, in Burma at present. Do you think democracy still has a chance? You have another election this year.
Yeah, we have another election. I think a lot is up in the air. What happens with China, how we deal with climate change, all the issues we've discussed. I would say that the success or failure of democracy in Burma, like in many other countries in the world, will depend a lot on whether or not we can craft a new economic agenda that's good for all people. And I think that's still a big question mark because of this focus on identity politics, but we'll see. And it's a big test, and we're at an inflection point, and what happens over the next 12 to 18 months will be very important.
Well, I think world over, democracy is a work in progress, so why should Burma, the new democracy, be any different? The book, ladies and gentlemen, is The Hidden History of Burma. Thanks so much for joining us. You've been a lovely audience.
Thank you so much, Thant Myint-U and Suhasini Haidar, and our sponsors, The Tribune, for this very honest and enriching session.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being an amazing audience. Now it's time for you to win something. So what I want you to do is quickly turn around and check if you're sitting on the Zomato hot seat. Let's just see where you're sitting. If you were in fact sitting, that's where you were sitting?